It is such a gloriously interesting story that should appeal to any punk rock person out there, because it is punk what these people did. You know, it's self-sufficient in the way that anybody who admires the Black Panthers would should see it. It's musical. It's it uses, you know, vintage synthesizers before they were vintage. At that time, there were a lot of them were just considered junk. The reason people pay $4,000 for a TB-303 to get that bass line from a failed instrument, an instrument that Roland failed with, is because people bought them for $50 and figured out how to make music that changed the world.
Today is the season 1 finale, and it is a doozy. My guest today is musician and music journalist Alex Maiolo. Alex is also a voting member of the Grammy Awards, an advisor to the DC-based music think tank Future of Music Coalition, and guest lecturer. That's just the tip of the Maiolo iceberg. I first talked with Alex when he guested on 2 episodes of Global Garage, for which he put together a primer on the history and legacy of krautrock. Today, Alex joins me to talk about his song selection and the black DIY origins of techno. Let's finish this season 1 mixtape. Alex Maiolo, thank you so much for helping us make a mixtape. Which opening track did you end up selecting?
Okay, well, there is a process of elimination. This is a very, very complicated and difficult thing for a person who's been a music nerd, you know, basically since he could talk.
As we were saying offline, that's one of the benefits about being the host, is that I don't have to deal with the I don't have to make the hard choices. I get to make my guests make the hard choices.
Exactly. Yeah, you're a cruel man. So basically, this is a little bit like, you know, even though it's ostensibly a narrowed down thing, it is a little bit like picking one of your favorite children. And so I think somewhat like how there's no one soulmate in the world, there are lots of soulmates. You just end up with one of your soulmates. Hopefully, everything goes well for you. I think I've ended up with a soulmate, but let's talk about how I got there. Okay, so what makes an opening track good? I would say they're the ones that start the album and they're so good that you want to hit the repeat button, like, or lift the needle and put it back. It's so good that, like, you can't even get into the album because the kickoff song is so good. I was thinking of The Good in Everyone by Sloan. What an album kickoff that is. It's so good. It's 2 minutes of perfection. Or The Headmaster Ritual by the Smiths. I generally listen to that song twice before continuing with the record. Then there are songs that are so good that, like, the first time I heard it, I knew things were going to change for me, that I had entered a new world, if you'd like to put it that way. I was thinking of, like, Paper House by Can. The first time I heard that song, I was like, okay, I think I'm a Can fan now. What does that mean? Stars of Track and Field by Bell and Sebastian. I knew that I was going to be listening to that record forever just by hearing that first song. They would have had to screw that record up really badly for me not to want to continue listening to Bell and Sebastian. Summer Babe by Pavement is a great example of that. Or Keep Trying by this sort of soul artist called Mandre, who I love. Then there's a similar thing, like Music as We Know It is going to change. This song is going to change what pop music even is. So, like, Autobahn or Computer World by Kraftwerk. I was a child when Autobahn came out. I was in 7th grade when Computer World came out. Both times when I heard those songs, I was like, I think this is different music. Paranoid Android by Radiohead is an amazing example of that. I remember hearing that and thinking, like, what is this even? And then I listened to a bunch of Radiohead. Radiohead's really good at that. You know, you can also say that, like, Planet Telex, that's a great kickoff. Bloom is a great kickoff. Packed Like Sardines, Everything in Its Right Place. These are all great paradigm shifting first tracks. Then there's the
Mm-hmm.
old 1-2 punch. Summer's Cauldron into Grass by XTC. Afternoon Speaker into All the Photos by The Sea and Cake. Circuitry of the Wolf into Chinaberry Tree by Mew. The opening track is 2 tracks. It's a 2-for-1 and it's badass. Then you get into songs that are like the modus operandi of the band is contained in one song for the record. I think of like Myrrh by The Church from Heyday. Amazing tune. La Femme d'Argent by Air, which kicks off Moon Safari, one of my favorite records of all time. Then you've got the whole kick-ass opening track preparing you for the album that's getting ready to come, right? So Expander by Future Sound of London, or The Song Remains the Same by Led Zeppelin. What an opening track that is. So is the Immigrant Song, right? Led Zeppelin's really good at this. And then on the subject of Led Zeppelin, you've got songs that kick ass out of the gate, but they're really kind of the only good song on the record. So Achilles' Last Stand, I think Presence is a good record, but Achilles' Last Stand hits above that record's weight. This is an interesting one. The Golden Road to Unlimited Devotion by the Grateful Dead. I hate the Grateful Dead. I cannot stand that band. But that song literally is, in my mind, the only good song they did. So, like, the first song on the first record is a super song, and then it's all downhill from there for me. All right, and then we're getting close. We're getting close. I'm going to say my runner-up here is Cups by Underworld. I think the Boku Fish record is the great underappreciated record of its era. And Cups is a good listen. It takes you places. It's really super. And as I started leaning into the electronic world a little bit, I came to my ultimate conclusion, which is Left Field is
Drum roll.
drum roll, Final Frontier by Underground Resistance. Probably the least known out of all of those. And it's going to sound a little bit high fidelity record store clerk nerd snob, but I can make a strong argument as to why.
Let's hear that argument.
Okay, that sounds good. So I've long maintained that the Detroit techno scene is the greatest DIY scene in pop music history. Now, I grew up in Chapel Hill in the 1990s, and that was one heck of an indie scene. I played in bands. I went to see lots of bands. All the bands came through. It was a joyous and wonderful time to be alive. Not better or worse than any other time necessarily, depending on who you are. But for me, it was meaningful every day, right? And people were 4-tracking their records and recording for cheap and pressing singles and doing all that DIY stuff that Gen X is known for. We were actually quite good at that, I felt like. And it did feel like a reaction to boomerism. But what I didn't know is about the same time in Detroit, there was a DIY scene that basically was putting our little college rock thing to shame. So put yourself in Detroit in the early 1980s, and that city's been left for dead. You know, the auto industry is gone.
Mm-hmm.
The most important music thing in that city is gone. Motown has moved to LA.
Motown.
Gary Gordy has moved it to LA. You've got kids who should, by historical precedent, be getting into trouble. There should be bad crime, and all that stuff did exist.
Mm-hmm.
But a group of kids who were reading all this like future philosophy by people like Alvin Toffler and listening to this radio show called The Electrifying Mojo, they were just drinking in all of these influences. On the Electrifying Mojo show, he was playing not only funk by like P-Funk and all that, but he's also playing 52s. He was playing Noi, and he was playing Gary Newman. And he'd have little philosophical breaks. And he'd talk about, you know, how the mothership had landed and he was here to spread good vibes and philosophy and all that. Apparently, he could interview Prince anytime he wanted to. Prince just adored him. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, he was one of the few people who basically just had carte blanche to talk to Prince. So these kids, are listening to this stuff and they're like, man, I want to make synthesizer music. So Juan Atkins goes to his grandmother and asks her some money, and she helps him buy a synthesizer, and he starts making music this way under the name Cybotron with a Vietnam vet called Rick Davis. So that is kind of incredible that drunk on Kraftwerk and funk, these guys make this futuristic music. They're reading Alvin Toffler, and Toffler's books talk about a post race future where, as long as we don't let the billionaires take control of the technology, that we'll all have better lives and better days, work less, be smarter, be healthier. Of course, we know how it turned out. The billionaires are building space phalluses and are working 65 hours a week for $7 an hour. But for a moment, these kids were just like really drunk on this idea. So that wave went by, and the second wave came along, and those people were a little more cynical. They not only loved all the things that Juan Atkins, Derek May, and Kevin Saunderson, who are collectively known as the Belleville Three because they grew up in Belleville outside of Detroit,
Hmm.
they not only liked that, but they were also kind of into the idea that the Black Panthers, who had been very strong in the Detroit area, probably as strong as they had been in Oakland or anywhere else, were like, if nobody's going to do it for us, if nobody's going to do it for the Black community, we need to do it for ourselves. So we like to think of the Black Panthers as these guys in berets and black holding guns and stuff like that. But nobody talks about the fact that they were feeding kids before school. Nobody was talking about how they were tutoring kids and really trying to make a better community because nobody else cared about them. So Underground Resistance as a kind of labeling collective was formed. This is done by a guy called Mike Banks, Mad Mike, as he's known, a guy named Jeff Mills, who's still out there doing it, and then later Robert Hood came into the fold. So just like their predecessors, they were buying up this so-called obsolete gear and making badass music with it. Now that synthesizers had gotten to actually sound like actual instruments, the ones with the knobs could be bought for very little, and they started making this sort of retro futuristic music with it. And Underground Resistance pushed the idea a little bit that like dystopia looms. Hear a little bit more of dark Detroit in the music. So they would be the second wave of Detroit techno.
What era are we talking about? What's the time period?
At this point, we're like right around 1990. So Cybotron would have been 82, 83. Juan Atkins went into like Model 500 after that, which would have been the mid 80s. And now we're at about 1990. So me being in college in 1990, I'm oblivious to all of this. Why? Because I'm a white guy who lives in a reasonably affluent college town. And I think like, oh, aren't we cool? Like we professors' kids and all that. We don't need no record label. We're gonna get down. We're gonna use our 4-track machines, and we're gonna make this mopey ass stuff about how work life is boring and whatnot. You know, and reference classic literature or whatever we're doing in this sort of mopey yet elegant way. With Steve Malkmus and people like that being our patron saint. Meanwhile, where shit is actually raw in Detroit, the very first Juan Atkins / Cybotron record had been put out on Fantasy, which was also Creedence Clearwater Revival's label. He decided that all things going forward would be put out on their own label. And so they started making their own labels. By the time Underground Resistance formed, Mike Banks had a real distrust and distaste for the record industry. So he really wasn't interested in getting signed. Again, we're going to do this for us because nobody else is going to do it for us. Every time record labels get hold of black people, they exploit black people. You can go back to the blues for that and jazz. Like, this is not a new thing. And you could even make an argument that Berry Gordy wasn't always cool to his own community. Record label bosses were first and foremost business people. So they just, all these people decide, like, well, how are we going to make this stuff happen? So a crew of them go down and go to the old record pressing plants and say, like, how do you make a record? And people at these plants are saying, well, if you need 10,000, 20,000 records made, this is how it gets done. We lathe them and we do this and that and the other. And they're like, what about if you want 200 or 300? And they're like, yeah, no, no, no. We don't really deal in volumes like that. And they're like, what other kind of work do you have right now that Motown's gone? And they're like, nothing. Like, cool, yeah. So let's talk about pressing 200 to 300 records. And very much to their credit, like the people at Archer and some of the record pressing plants there became, like, not only open to the idea of it, they became really helpful. They're like,
Nice.
okay, so check it out. When you're recording music, these are things that you need to take into consideration. If you want to do something interesting with your music, be careful that you don't do that. Or, like, whether you put 22 minutes on the side of a record or 20 will really affect fidelity. And, these are mostly older white men who are really, really partnering up and being cool with these young kids who are just thirsty for knowledge, right? And so they decide they're going to go ahead and put these records out. And for the most part, it just stays within their community. Their community becomes unlike any indie community I've ever known. Crazily fun and supportive and whatnot, but it's mostly locked into Detroit. Richie Houghton is coming over from Windsor, Canada, which is right across the bridge. Oddly, it's south of Detroit into Canada. And, he's looked at with a little bit of scrutiny because he's a young white kid, but soon he's in the fold and he's doing great, right? And because Richie Houghton, well, I should back up a minute. Part of the underground resistance credo is to not draw attention to themselves. Celebrity is bad. I can't say that for everybody, but most of them are like, let the music speak for itself. Because the minute you start getting into, like, celebrity stuff, the music suffers and you take away from your art. These are manifesto people, right? So Richie Houghton is a little less concerned about that, and he has a little white privilege working in his favor, I guess, if that's okay to say. And the Detroit guys like him all right. He starts traveling a little, and at the same time, members of the Detroit techno crew start going over to England, and because their music is getting kind of popular there through very underground channels. The same thing that would have been like my friends and me passing around singles, and like mixtapes and all that kind of stuff. They're doing the exact same thing, and it ended up in, like, dance clubs that were in, like, closed down warehouses, that, like, illegal raves and stuff like that, like real DIY stuff. So now the attention from these kind of university educated kids, who are not unlike the indie rock scene I was in, is on, like, what's happening in Detroit and also Chicago. So these guys start getting brought over to Britain like celebrities. Like, they kind of like how, when Cream and John Mayall and the Yardbirds were popular, they started bringing over, like, Leadbelly to play. That's kind of what's happening again. There's an old expression that the British are very good at giving Americans their own music back to them. And this is a
That's
yeah.
so true.
Yeah. The Beatles would show up and people would be like, whoa, man, where did you learn this? And you're like, Carl Perkins and Little Richard. And they're like, who's that?
Punk too, of course.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Like, the people are like, the Sex Pistols are great. Where did they learn that? They're like, the New York Dolls. They're like, who's that? So this is just another case of that,
Yeah.
And so all of a sudden this starts to blow up, and it becomes giant in Britain, and you get bands like, I'm skipping around a little bit, 808 State, obviously the Prodigy comes out of that, and
Mm-hmm.
stuff that doesn't quite sound, so for lack of a better word, black. It's not as funky, it's not as influenced by soul, it doesn't have any political side to it or anything. Nobody's going to say Prodigy's funky, but it's definitely techno influenced. I mean, maybe it's a little funky. So this DIY spirit grew into that, and that, worked its way into the rest of Europe. Berlin became this techno capital around the time the wall fell down. The formerly East German DJ refers to techno music as the East German liberation dance. And
Hmm.
it's probably the most common musical language of Europe, even though it's not that popular here. Berlin is kind of
Hmm.
its capital, even if Detroit is the source. And
Interesting.
very much in line with the other quote I just said, somebody at Trezor Records, I think, in Berlin said that we're just keeping techno music safe until the Americans realize what they've got. Yeah,
Oh, that's so good.
it is. So the reason I've picked this song, the reason I've picked The Final Frontier is because as an EP, it's not something you could just go out to the store and buy. You had to seek it
Hmm.
out. The internet has made it so we can go out and listen to things. Some of my favorite records, like SF Sorrow by the Pretty Things, is an excellent example. I'd never heard it until I could get it on the internet because I could never find it. And man, am I
Hmm.
the demographic for that record. That record should have been in my life when I was 15, and I didn't hear it till I was 40. This music has remained timeless. It is massively influential, and it
Hmm.
all happened without the record industry infrastructure. That is incredible to me. You can draw
That is.
a direct line to the bullshit that's happening at Burning Man right now.
Hmm.
You can draw a direct line to these $250,000 a night DJ things
Mm.
straight back to techno, except for the fact, and I just found this out the other day, all 10 of the highest paid DJs are men.
Hmm.
Nine of the highest of the top 10 are white.
Mm.
One of the 10 is of Asian descent, so he's not white,
Hmm.
but he's the son of the guy who started the Benihana restaurant chain. So he's rich, rich, rich to begin with.
Oh, wow.
So once again, black people cut out of the
Hmm.
conversation of the music that they created. Now, you can make a strong element that this music wouldn't have existed without a strong argument, rather, that this music wouldn't have existed without Kraftwerk. They will tell you
Hmm.
that. They have a
Hmm.
strong connection with Kraftwerk, who are really shy people for the most part, but they
Hmm.
they love these folks. And in fact, one of the only sanctioned mixes of a Kraftwerk song was Expo 2000 by Underground
Hmm.
Resistance. So, what incredible odds these guys overcame. It's a lot more than Pavement doing victory lap tours right now, which I support, by the way. I love Pavement.
Sure.
They changed music history, and they
Hmm.
did it all against all odds, drunk on funk, Kraftwerk, and Alvin Toffler's books. And yet they've been kind of written out of the whole thing. And when you listen to the Final Frontier EP, which is available on YouTube, from beginning to end, it still sounds like the future.
Listeners, for some context, I did not know what song Alex was going to pick, so I have not yet had a chance to listen to this song.
Yeah.
So I'm just as excited as you listeners, I hope, are to give this a listen after the episode. I'm going to dive right in as soon as we finish talking about this. This is fantastic, and it's interesting to see, history continuing to repeat itself again. We have so many black musicians that have defined genres and have been written out through the appropriation and the just business taking advantage of the culture. And it's interesting because I feel like we're just starting to, with the internet, and I'm curious for your perspective,
Mhm.
starting to dig some of that back up again. Do you feel like Detroit is starting to, do you think it's getting that reputation back? Do you think it's getting that credit back? Do you think people are discovering, to paraphrase what the German said, discover what we have?
What we already have. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think little by little, and I had to give a lot of thought. I've written a long piece on this for Reverb, which is why it's fresh on my mind. And I thought, like,
Mm-hmm.
why, with such a compelling story, is this not bigger and more well known?
Right.
And part of that, I think, is the no celebrities thing. The record industry is a bunch of people just clawing over each other and stepping on each other's faces to
Yeah.
get to the top, right?
Huh.
And these people were not interested in that. Maybe at the very beginning, Juan Atkins thought, I don't know, I can't speak for him, but maybe Juan Atkins thought, hey, it'd be cool to be a musician for a living, and just assumed, by signing to Fantasy Records, that, like, that's just how you did it.
Mm-hmm.
Probably a bad record label to pick, because CCR was at legal war with them for a long time. But nevertheless, he obviously went the route of signing to a label, a subsidiary. I believe
Mm-hmm.
they're a subsidiary of A&M. I'm not sure of it. But very shortly after that, like, all of these people started making their own labels. So, like,
Mm-hmm.
Saunderson had his own label. May had his own label. And they had multiple labels. Jeff Mill has gone on record as saying, like, he'll start a label, and then when he's completed what he wants to do with that label, he'll shut that label down and basically start another. So he's not even building,
Mm-hmm.
like, brand recognition, because it's not necessary to him. Even though he's probably arguably the best known of that first and second wave crew, like, he's been awarded the honor of letters by the French government, Letter of the Arts,
Hmm.
because he's, like, worked with artists outside the scene. He's worked with Tony Allen. He gets out there. He's amazing. They all are amazing. But anyway, basically the no celebrities thing probably didn't help very much. The
Interesting.
disdain for the record industry probably didn't make the record industry come knocking.
Yeah.
So the fact that, here's some other things that I came across. A lot of the, like, kind of funk lovers in the Detroit and Chicago area didn't find their music to be, and I finger quote, black enough. It was a
Interesting.
little too nerdy and
Hmm.
technology driven, and, like, people want to just go out and party. They don't want to talk about, like, what is the future of transportation. Like, Drexia, one of the acts that came out of that scene,
Yeah.
their entire myth is based around the idea that during the Middle Passage, when pregnant slave women were thrown overboard to their deaths because they were too expensive to keep alive. I mean, think how grim that is.
Yeah.
That they gave birth to their babies underwater, who had only known living in liquid. So they were born underwater and remained liquid dwellers, right? They
Huh.
became Atlanteans, basically,
Yeah.
started their own
Yeah.
empire. So they emerged from tragedy to become strong, which, of course, is an allegory for what any member of the black community would have hoped for at that time, and
Mm-hmm.
still does. That's a little heavy, when you just
Yeah.
do a freaking
Yeah.
boogie. That's that, and so that probably didn't help very much. But now we live in this
Hmm.
internet age, and people are interested in stories. I'm endlessly impressed with people who are 20, 25 years old right now, and, like, how they just are open minded about music.
Hmm.
So I think that will help a lot. And there's this long running music festival that happens every Memorial Day called Movement, that happens in
Hmm.
Detroit, and it's a combination of like Detroit artists
Hmm.
and people coming back to Detroit. So like Underworld played it this year. Surgeon played. Charlotte DeWitt. So a bunch of Europeans came over and played it
Hmm.
because they're like, I finally get to play like at the wellspring of this music. So we'll see. We'll see if it takes off and finally gets the credit it deserves. A friend of mine called DeForest Brown Jr. has written a book called Assembling a Black Counterculture, and his book really goes deep into that about
Hmm.
how we need to return the blackness to techno. He provocatively has used the term regularly, make techno black again. And yes, I understand the irony of you and me, two white guys, talking about this, but I also feel like everybody who is interested in writing historical records, no
Hmm.
matter what they are, no matter how insignificant they are, needs to speak up.
Yeah.
So the reason I picked this song is not only because it's just good, it's a good, cool song on a cool EP that like has a little electro energy to it. Like you can break
Yeah.
dance to it, like it is cool, but also because how it got here and what it's done and what its adjacents have created is a
Hmm.
miracle, and needs to be talked about in the same breath. That movement needs to be talked about in the same breath that we talk about blues and jazz as far as worldwide
Yeah.
influence. Basically, all electronic dance music comes from this.
Hmm.
All of it, even the crappy stuff.
Yeah. It's amazing. I mean, generally pretty oblivious. Growing up, I always just had the assumption that techno was this more European
Yeah,
uh, cultural music, and it wasn't until I talked to you when we first recorded that episode of Global Garage where you talked about the panel that you were moderating at
yeah,
at South by about making techno black again and the roots in Detroit. I
yeah,
had no idea. I mean, I think I had known that that there was a connection in Detroit, but I wasn't
sure.
necessarily aware to what degree it was significantly cut out of the narrative.
Oh yeah, and like like you can even say that like most people know that house music comes from Chicago, and house
Hmm.
music isn't adjacent to techno. There's a lot of
Hmm.
crossover. Like if you listen to Kevin Saunderson's first big hit, a song called, well, one of his first big hits, "Big Fun," which made it to the radio in Britain.
Hmm.
There are some house influences on there, and the so-called Belleville Three were going to Chicago to see what was happening.
Hmm.
They're taking field trips because they were nerds that way. They're like, I want to know how does MIDI work? I want to figure that
Yeah.
out. I want to see what's happening in Chicago and all that. And it was an interesting scene to go to because Frankie Knuckles was now DJing in that scene, and Frankie
Hmm.
had come from New York, from Paradise Garage, and like all of that gay club culture that ultimately gave birth to disco with a
Hmm.
capital D and a TM on the end of it. That like people, in bougie people in the suburbs ultimately started dancing to in 1978, 1979. Not
Yeah.
the stuff that was, like, again, for lack of a better term, gay music,
Hmm.
in gay safe spaces before that term was used.
Hmm.
So Frankie Knuckles had come from that and kind of brought that to Chicago in a way as an ambassador, if you want to break it down to something very simple.
Hmm.
And Detroit music kind of came from funk and future shock literature and all of that. These two things blurred at times, and house music, of course, is extremely popular in Britain during the rave scene, is much
Hmm.
more than techno, I guess. But like every time somebody like Madonna comes along and drops a song like Vogue, which owes a debt to the music we're talking about.
Mhm.
Like, people are just like, oh yeah, she's tapped into the European club scene with her new hit single Vogue. Nobody talks about the fact that this is black music from Detroit and
Yeah.
Chicago that she's tapped into,
Yeah.
right? So Madonna has given Americans their own music back to them again. This is She did it again with Ray of Light, and so I'm not here to diss Madonna. I'm not,
Sure.
but she didn't go out of her way to kind of cut people into that conversation so much. I don't
Yeah.
think, So yeah, that's the thing about this that's so fascinating to me. It is such
Hmm.
a gloriously interesting story that should appeal to any punk rock person out there because it is
Yeah.
punk what these people did. You know, it's self sufficient in the way
Hmm.
that anybody who admires the Black Panthers
Hmm.
would should see. It's musical. It uses you know vintage synthesizers before they were vintage. At that time, a
Yeah.
lot of them were just considered junk. The
Hmm.
reason people pay $4,000 for a TB-303 to get that bass line from a failed instrument, an instrument that Roland failed with, is because people bought them for $50 and figured out how to make music that changed the world.
Wow. I mean, you picked a song that changed the world. I got to give it to
Yeah,
you. Thank
yeah.
you
Well,
for sharing that story. I'm
I wouldn't
glad.
go so far as to say that this song's a little bit of an outlier. The reason I picked it,
Sure.
I would say that the people I'm talking about changed the world. The reason
Sure,
I
sure.
picked The Final Frontier is because it's probably the song that made me go, wait a minute, what is this and how did this
Hmm.
music come to be? So it's kind of my entree into the whole thing. And it's also, like a lot of that music, it still sounds very, very good.
Yeah.
And when you listen to it, you go like, yeah, I know that sound. Yeah, I know that sound too.
Hmm.
Yep, there's that sound. And it's like, uh-huh. And you're listening to not quite year zero music, but it's pretty close. And so yeah, that's the one I keep going back to. I love Drexia and I love Underground Resistance. And so I went to um, Detroit for Movement this year for an article I'm writing.
Hmm.
And I was there with my friend Dan Bowen, who played in a bunch of like indie rock bands in the 90s. Dan and I went and we couldn't find the house, even though we were standing right in front of it. There are no signs on it or anything. Finally, somebody sticks their head out and they're like, hey, you want to come in? We're like, yeah. So we go in and there's this museum of like all the old like gear, like old TR-909 drum machines and stuff
Wow.
like that. And then we go down in the basement where Submerged Records is, and every record in there is something that was basically pressed locally in a white sleeve.
Wow.
I bought 18 records that day.
Wow.
And and then as I went upstairs, I looked in the back of the room and I noticed there's the old Scully lathe. Like they still lathe in house and stuff like that. They don't press in
Wow.
house, but they'll do like four editions of 40 lathes, and you can basically only buy them there. And that stuff
Wow.
was so wanted by some people that
Yeah.
when they were working with some of the people they were working at the lathing and pressing facilities, they would go to them and say, hey, some of these things are being bootlegged. What do we do? And one of these old guard guys who was helping him out was like, I got an idea. Why don't we lathe this backwards? So you drop the needle at the label and it plays out towards the edge. Then you'll be able to
Oh.
identify it because nobody's gonna bootleg it that way.
Oh, wow.
And then when Jeff Mills was doing his Rings of Saturn record after this kind of stuff, he goes, man, I got an idea. I want every song to have a lockout groove, like the end of Sergeant Pepper, where when it gets to the end of the song, it just goes around in a circle and sounds like a sustained note.
Huh.
And he goes, okay, let me do some math on this. And he goes back to Jeff and he says, every song is going to have to be 133 beats per minute. 33 and a third, right?
Yeah.
All the songs have to be 133 beats per minute. And every song on the Rings of Saturn record is a lockout groove. So you play the song, it
Huh.
gets to the end of the song, and it becomes a sustained note. Then you move the
Wow.
stylus to the next song. I own one of these, and it's one of my prized collection records.
Huh.
Yeah. So that's what I mean is like, we didn't do that. We thought we were freaking cool because we made cassette tapes on 4-track. Or like the guys in Polvo, who, bless them, they're one of the greatest bands ever to come out of this town, are like,
Yeah.
yes, we're going to use, like an oud on this song, or we're going to play, Aeolian scales or whatever, which nobody does that in punk rock. Bless them for it, because it felt good, but like
Yeah.
nobody was doing this kind of stuff.
That's wild.
Yeah.
That's wild. Thank you for picking this track. This was an illuminating conversation.
Wonderful, man. That's what I was hoping for. I figured plenty of people were going to pick, like, songs that are great,
Mm-hmm.
like Achilles' Last Stand,
Mm-hmm.
or Taxman. What a great opener that is. I
Mm-hmm.
figured plenty of people were going to do that. So why would I want to compete with? It's not a competition, but why would I want to compete with people who are picking songs that are like for all time excellent
Yeah.
tunes, when this
Yeah.
could be an opportunity to maybe share new music in an era where we have instant gratification?
I think you made a fantastic choice, and I'm very much excited to fall down this wormhole.
Awesome. That's great.
Thank you so much, Alex. I really appreciate it. It was great talking with you and
Anytime.
learning so much.
Anytime. Okay. Thanks.
If you've been to letsmixtape.com for a show transcript before, you'll know that they're usually full of notes and links and all that. This episode, yeah, lots of them. Be sure to check it out. Regular listeners to the show will also know that I am conservative when it comes to music copyright on this podcast, so I won't be playing Final Frontier, but I would like to leave you with a song from one of Alex's many music projects. The track that I'm going to play is from Themes for Great Cities, Talon. Themes from Great Cities is this really cool project Alex is a part of, where he and other musicians record sounds from cities and incorporate them into a music composition. Their first performance, Talon, was put together in 2 weeks and performed in Estonia at Talon Music Week in September of 2021. But before I play the song, I just wanted to thank all of my guests from season 1, as well as all you listeners out there. I appreciate your support and patience as this all came together. Work is already starting on season 2, and I'm not going to reveal the prompt yet, but I'm very excited with how it's all coming together. I don't have a release date yet, but it will be sometime early next year. Between seasons, be sure to follow the podcast at Let's Mixtape on social for updates, insights, clips, all that jazz. Speaking of jazz, as promised, here is Themes for Great Cities with Jazz Halyards. If you liked what you've heard from Season 1, be sure to rate and review the podcast to help new people discover the show. Theme music was composed by the one and only Scotty Sandwich. Thanks for listening, and let's make a mixtape. We'll return next year with Season 2.